Everything in your composition has a relationship with everything else, and it's important to know how an element relates to another. When our text is like this, it appears small, but now it appears huge. The context, the relationship and contrast between the other elements in the scene help to define that. And we don't even need to use those symbols of the earth and a boot to understand the meaning of the scale. Even with just shapes, this feels much smaller than this object up here, or much larger than this one. Just a shape will do the trick. Each element's perceived size is dictated by the context of its surrounding elements, and not just its size, everything. Now, of course, using imagery that we're familiar with makes this much easier to understand, and that is just one of the tools in our design toolkit, taking elements that our audience understands, they knows, they have preconceived notions about, and then using that as a shortcut for communication, or even to twist that into something unexpected. One thing to remember is that when we change one of our elements in a composition, we are changing all of them. For example, video editing, maybe in a movie. When you make a bunch of cuts to make one scene faster, without adding anything, you are making the next scene feel slower because it is being watched directly after something much faster. That context changes it. Changing one thing changes everything. And I don't want to put you off making changes or trying anything new or to make that intimidating. Just know that it's a bit of a back and forth. When you make one element bigger, you might need to space things out a little more just to make room for it, or nudge it away from an element so the composition feels more balanced. You can rarely just make a change to one element and leave the rest alone. That's why we try to sort these things out in the early stages while figuring out our composition for the bigger, larger elements, that is, before everything is detailed and refined. Now, with certain styles, if you're working with simple vector shapes like I am here, and you're not building quite as complex as a scene, this isn't as big of a deal. Moving some text and shapes around really isn't that hard to do. You can create a bunch of different compositions really quickly. And if I'm not sure of this composition of elements, I can quickly grab my anchor point tool, select the artboard, hold the Alt option, drag it down, and I've got a duplicate copy to make more adjustments. And there's still room for changing the overall composition, even long after we've designed the details, if we imagine all of these were detailed elements. That is one of the benefits of working digitally. It's just not as ideal as working it out beforehand, ideally with small thumbnail sketches, which we will go deep into later in this lesson. But the more complex, the more detailed, the more elements you have in your image, the more important this becomes. But with more than one element on our canvas, we're going to have to think about balance. Often we like our images to feel balanced. Balance is the distribution of visual weight to create harmony and a stable feeling in our image. If the balance of something goes off, it can make the image feel uneasy, which might be something you want to communicate. So this chapter is going to focus more on the emotion side of communication rather than comprehension. How we can arrange things on a canvas to produce a more calming, stable emotion or a more chaotic, energetic one. Now, balance, I think, is important to humans, not just because we don't fall over in a very literal sense, which is important, but if you are like me in some regard, you might find yourself with the instinct to align pieces of paper on the edge of a desk at right angles or your pens in a row because it just feels right. And I'm sure if you have a bunch of shelves on your home, you don't have one shelf completely empty and one shelf really packed full. We tend to evenly distribute these things. You wouldn't have all of your furniture on one side of the room and the other side completely empty. I think we do this not just because it's efficient, but I think we visually want to see things distributed in a way that is pleasing. And the simplest way to achieve a balanced composition is to make it symmetrical, like we have here. We have the same amount of elements on the left and the right, and even on top and the bottom. It's very orderly, it's very formal. But even a large symmetrical composition with a strong central anchor needs to have its balance in check. So let's start simple. Here's an image of a planet with some stars around it. And here's another image, the same planet, with stars around it. But if you look at these, it should be pretty obvious that this one on the right feels unbalanced. And looking at it, knowing that these stars are all the way here on the left, it might not feel pleasant, might even feel a little stressful. Think about each element as having a physical weight, and our canvas is on this balancing scale. These stars are going to tip this image over to the left. It is not balanced. Whereas these stars on the left feel balanced, even though there's more of them on the left side of the composition. So let's bring balance to this image. And we don't need to use the same arrangement as before. We have one star that's larger, so maybe we put that on one side, and then the two smaller ones on this side. And let's not do exactly what we did over here on the left. Let's put these over on the bottom, and maybe let's angle this planet as well. That lets us create some symmetry vertically as well. Let's push it up towards the middle a bit more. And to me, this one on the right now maybe feels even more balanced than this one on the left, because this one now has a top to bottom symmetry as well. And it isn't complete symmetry, but a symmetry of weight. Now, it feels nicer to look at. And there's a lot of back and forth because how we affect one element affects the relationship of everything else. We can try spacing things apart. If we move these stars down here, maybe we'll want to move this one up here for balance. I really like this process. I think it's kind of a fun problem to solve, moving things around, getting hotter or colder to what feels right and feels balanced in my mind. Now, I often use stars in my illustrations designs to add balance, but I can also find myself constantly adding more elements to make things feel balanced, and I can really go overboard by adding so many of them that it becomes an absolute mess. Where if I create one thing, and then I figure, well, I need to add another one over the other side in order to balance it out, and before long, the whole canvas starts filling up with stars, and we lose the point of the original design in the first place. So try to avoid that. It can be very easy to overwork your design if you're trying to get the perfect balance that way. Balance is just one element. And when you're thinking about balance at the composition level, I think it should be at the largest scale. But balance doesn't have to be symmetrical, and it probably isn't practical or effective for the majority of scenes. But we can achieve balance with asymmetry. Here we've got some basic shapes of different sizes. Well, these four are kind of a similar size, so let's scale this one down a little more so there's a bit more variety, and maybe scale this one up. Okay, so now without changing any of their sizes, we can create balance by arranging them. And these aren't going to be symmetrical because these are all completely different shapes. So let's start moving these around. Over here on the left, it's already feeling very heavy, weighed down by all of these objects. So let's just move them about, and I'm going to push them maybe towards the center. We'll keep this big one on the left and try to balance that out by having more objects on the right. Now the circle is the most different object. This one doesn't have any angle, so maybe if we keep that in the middle, that'll feel more balanced. And already, I think this is feeling balanced. And even though this is asymmetrical, at a larger scale, it kind of is. Because everything is evenly spaced, we kind of see this as one mass in the middle. And if we're just spacing things out evenly on the canvas, it can get boring if that's all you're doing throughout all of your compositions. The whole thing can start to feel gray and bland and lose any hierarchy or contrast that you might have established. So let's try to find some balance without these being evenly spaced. So let's split these up into two sections. And I think if we have our biggest object and our two smallest objects, we might be able to get these compositions to feel balanced, or at least as balanced as they could be on either side. There, I think maybe we put one of these objects over here as well. Yes, this one's of course going to need 3 compared to the 2 over here. And there we found some balance, but again, pretty symmetrical. One shape over here, one shape over here. Subtle differences in between them, but pretty much the same. Another way we can increase the balance is by increasing the breathing space. When you've got lots of large objects in a canvas, it can be harder to find a balance between all of them. So let's scale lots of these down and make them much smaller, and then spread them out quite far. And I'm going to try to keep them roughly in the same proportion so that this square is still much bigger than all the rest. There. Now this is feeling pretty balanced. We do have a much larger object over here, so not totally, but by having all of this breathing room in between them, that can really help because it's a little harder to notice the visual difference in the weight between them because there is such a vast ocean of nothing in between all the different elements. It is much more obvious when something is closer to one another that their scales are different. This circle looks so much smaller than this square, but when they're over here, yeah, it's smaller, but that effect is not as pronounced. And it could also be a mistake to try to make everything big to fill the space. Like we talked about earlier, if everything is prominent in the hierarchy, nothing is. When everything is big, nothing is. Sometimes making something smaller can make something else seem bigger and have more impact, or moving it closer or further away from that object. But again, we've been balancing this composition and we've made it symmetrical. It can be tempting to just spread everything out to achieve balance and form equal-sized masses on either side of the canvas, because it is the easiest way to do it. So balance isn't only keeping things simple and keeping them on the left or the right side of the canvas and keeping those masses equal. Let's make something truly asymmetrical now. There, that is asymmetrical. And to me, this still feels kind of balanced. Balance isn't a total dichotomy. It's not balanced or unbalanced. Some things are slightly balanced or slightly more balanced. To me, this feels pretty balanced. And that may be because they're all kind of on this one diagonal. It kind of feels like a symmetrical mass. If you divide this canvas into the top left and the bottom right, it can feel symmetrical that way. But size and position aren't the only thing affecting balance. Color and detail can affect it too. Really, everything does, even the negative space between objects. And it's a very complex tapestry as all of these elements interact with one another. To make this more asymmetrical, we can color one object differently. Now this feels much more weighted to this side because this shape is so much more prominent than the others now. But we can balance that by having one of these shapes up here on the right having that same color. Even though it is asymmetrical, we're still kind of tipping the scales. Even though this area of color is so much bigger than this one, it kind of balances out because now we have two dark objects on this side, which kind of equivocate one large white mass on this side, and we have a smaller dark mass than the larger white mass on this side. So even though they are the opposite colors, they're kind of balancing one another out in a yin-yang kind of format. Now, balance is something that's always a conscious thought when it's being used. Like most principles of design, it becomes something you feel in an image without noticing it specifically. Now, let's take a look at some examples so we can see it in action and for us to get used to more thinking about balance and how different elements affect it, what's causing it to be balanced or imbalanced, and how you can use these tools you've learned to adjust it. Here are some examples from a series of designs by Josh Warren, and I think these show a neat example of balance, these collection of elements. They feel incredibly balanced, they are asymmetric, and they create a lot of interest because they have a collection of similar masses like these books over here and varying levels of detail. Everything isn't the same monotonous shape or color or spacing. We have large areas of blue, small areas of blue, large shapes, small shapes, lots of detail, not much detail. There's a lot of variation, and that is harder to keep balanced. And let's focus on this one on the left. We have one main centered element that is kind of holding everything together, and we have everything sitting on a baseline. And the shapes around it, even though they are all different, they create a pretty symmetrical triangle mass. The books on the left are balanced by this house. They have similar colors in a similar amount. Now let's see what this looks like without the house. I'm going to cover it up with some shapes I prepared earlier. Now it starts to feel a little less balanced, but it still looks okay because these speech bubbles are now balancing out these books on the left. But we still have this sort of baseline at the bottom, which makes this feel like a kind of physical edge, and these speech bubbles might want to tip this massive shapes over. That's kind of how I feel when I see this. So how would we remedy that, bring more balance to this without reintroducing that house? Well, I think one thing we need to do is get rid of this ground plane to make these objects all feel like they're floating. It's a bit too coincidental that these two objects are lined up at the moment. And we can do that by adding more books. Here I've made this one book thicker and added another one in a similar ratio of colors to these bubbles on the right. I've added a bit more gray than we have blue. Now it's way more asymmetrical, but still it's got some symmetry. It's symmetrical now along this diagonal axis. And that center mass is kind of two flipped over triangles that are symmetrical, but opposite as well. But what's really important to making this feel balanced isn't necessarily the axis that they're symmetrical or that these are flipped, is that there is one single central shape that these are all forming. And because that one shape is symmetrical, anything, as long as we fill in roughly that shape with our elements, it will feel balanced as well, as if it's sort of inheriting that symmetry of that main large object. And here there's not too many details on one side or the other. They're kind of distributed evenly if we imagine that scale that we drew earlier. Another example I want to show is by Studio Iannis. So this one, we've got more variety, more asymmetry, but also it has that similar flipped symmetry, like we created with the previous example. We can see the two main shapes as being a rectangle with a kind of curled rounded edge, and that's been flipped over and repeated on the other side. Now on this side we have more detail, and we're kind of drawn to this because it has more contrast, has more of the lighter color and more of the darker color. So that contrast creates hierarchy, and we're drawn here first, then to this bottom left side of the image. And I think having more contrast in this side and more detail is balanced out by having more rhythm and repetition in a lot of the elements down here. And we'll get into rhythm and repetition later in this lesson. But again, balance doesn't need to be a super precise practice where you're assigning weights and angles mathematically. So this aspect is more of an art than a science. There's not concrete rules you need to follow. It's just a feeling of things being orderly in the right place. And that when your composition is feeling imbalanced, like it's not in the right place, you can alter that by moving elements, changing colors, changing the shapes, changing where they are, their position, to make it feel more evenly distributed for a more easy and cohesive viewing experience, which you might not always want, which we will get to soon. Now, this is a fantastic design from Matt Chinworth. Now, this one is super asymmetrical. We have a clear hierarchy, we're drawn right to the center, and we've got leading lines kind of in and out of that, so we're always looking and drawn to this spot. And we have all this detail on the left. We have so much more detail on the left than on the right. But I still see this as being balanced by what we do have on the right. So even though on the left there is more elements, it itself in this big kind of vacuum of lines and texture and dots and shapes, they're all pretty evenly distributed. So to me, this kind of forms like one big triangle that it kind of forms almost the same color as if this is like a gray value, this whole thing. even though it is filled with this essentially a texture. It is balanced out by having more variety in the forms of the right. The left side has more going on because there are more elements interacting, but it's kind of the same frequency of noise. Whereas on the right, we have lots of very specific elements. We have a line of white circles, a line of green rectangles, of teal trapeziums, and we have these pillars and specific characters doing specific things interacting with them. Even though there's a lot of stuff here on the left, it's only really one piece of information, a whole bunch of stuff coming out of this, I guess, machine portal. Whereas on the right, we have at least 3 specific things happening, these characters each introducing these elements. Here we kind of have a kind of stew of all of those ingredients all evenly distributed within the pot, within this shape. Whereas on the right, all of those same ingredients are laid out more evenly. Now again, it's not always the case of one element defines this to be balanced. It is a combination of all the things coming together to feel right. And it's okay if these concepts don't click right away. If these concepts are new to you, that is fine. Try to let the examples and what I've said wash over you. Some of it will absorb into you without you knowing, and we'll be coming back to revisit these throughout the course. Because balance and tension in a composition, they're a part of really every design we make in some way. So let's bring in that other similar concept. Tension and energy. So this is another element we can use in our composition in a similar way to balance. Now I think tension is maybe even less of a clear of a thing to define. It's not necessarily to create a tense feeling, which it can do. I see it more as how the relationship of objects to one another interact to give them weight, and how aspects of that can give a sense of speed and momentum. And hopefully over the rest of this chapter, we can get closer aligned on what I mean. So tension in design, you can imagine as 2 elements that are in opposition, almost fighting against one another. Like we have visually with this text here and this pointy white shape. And this kind of adds energy because it's in the middle of an action. Things aren't at rest, they're not evenly distributed and balanced like a stew that has settled. Here it is being mixed up, things are being added, things are being thrown in, things are still moving about. We're leaving things unresolved, and that can make it feel alive and add movement. Not necessarily literal movement, but tension that can imply things moving without them actually being in motion. Now, a very simple way to do this is to introduce a lot more diagonal lines and sharp forms. Diagonal lines and shapes tend to have more energy to them, more than vertical and horizontal lines that kind of rest safely on that sort of ground plane that we perceive. Now, round shapes, they tend to not have much tension. This image would feel pretty calm to look at. But when we essentially have the same composition with triangles, this feels a bit more tense, there's a bit more energy. There's motion as our eyes dart up and down the lengths of these triangles. Whereas when I look at these shapes, my eyes are kind of rolling around softly. That's how it feels to me. Your mileage may vary depending on your eyes and your brain and your experiences with triangles and blobs. But to me, these feel much more sharp. And when I say more alive, these shapes kind of feel more organic. So I don't mean alive in the sense of living, but in moving. And I think we can make this example more tense by making it more asymmetrical, less balanced. Here we've increased the size of this triangle, reduced this one, and to me this feels like there's more tension. There's more energy, and I think it's because it's more dynamic. We have more variety, the triangles are of different shapes. When my eyes move down this, it's like a one long whoosh, and then around the small one it's doo-doo. And forgive me for using sound effects to describe visual things, but especially if you're from animation, you know that can be really helpful to try and perceive, I guess, the emotion and speed of something that we want to happen. But that's how this feels to me. But we can add tension to round, safe, blobby, balanced compositions. So here, evenly distributed, very balanced, very nice soft objects. But if we start to move these 2 closer to one another, to me now this is starting to feel like there's a little more tension around here, because these 2 things are the only things not evenly distributed. And the closer we get them, this gap feels like it's almost too close. Compared to when they were separated earlier, this feels like they're in motion, like they're about to cross over and touch one another. And in this negative space, we can kind of feel it being squeezed as our eyes kind of roll around these shapes, moving around nice and freely, but here it's kind of squeezed and squashed in this area here that's about to be, like, we can even flip-flop between what's the negative space and the positive space. The black could be the background, and this is kind of some honey or some liquid about to be, torn at this point here. There's added interest and added tension. We're drawn to this point, which is another, great tool for hierarchy, to draw our eyes to one area. And if we bring these shapes until they're absolutely touching, now we don't just have these round blobby shapes that are very satisfying and calming. We also have these infinitely sharp, pointy areas, and our eyes are instantly drawn there because it's very different. So here's another example to describe motion on a simpler scale. Here we have a rectangle. It is safe. It is still. Nothing in here feels like it's in motion. It is at rest. Nothing is happening. But as soon as we rotate it, now when we assess this image, there's a little bit of motion. We could see this, is this rectangle falling? Has it been thrown up in the air? Is it coming from the left or the right? It adds a little bit of tension because something is about to happen or has just happened. And a lot of that is coming from these diagonal shapes. And I think especially because they are contrasted with the right angles, these perpendicular edges of our canvas. And in pretty much all cases, we're going to be using a canvas, a composition size, a display that is a square or a rectangle in some regard. But diagonals don't create energy just because we feel like it might be falling or tumbling. Here we have some diagonal shapes that are locked in place. And these can add tension as well because they are braced against something. If something is diagonal, it can either be seen to be falling or it's being held in place by some form of tension. These two walls are holding this kind of little bridge area in place. And to me, when I see this, I can kind of feel specific tension where it kind of meets these objects, especially in the corners where these elements interact. Horizontal and vertical lines, they tend to have more of a solid, secure presence. Whereas diagonal lines, even though these are the same objects, they have a kind of angular momentum. They kind of feel like a ramp we can slide down or launch off from. And these objects are still kind of all aligned on the same diagonal plane. But when we rotate them, to me, this creates even more tension, more energy, because now we have so much more variety of angles here. Previously, they were all going, in one direction, down to the left, down to the right, all at 90 degrees. But now we have all of these different shapes in the negative space and all different angles, even though these shapes are made up of squares or rectangles, they all have right angles, but now we've created all these different angles within them. To me, that makes it feel more exciting. Now, curved lines, of course, can also imply a lot of energy and motion and can add tension, mostly when they approach and interact with other elements though. And this doesn't mean that tension can't be balanced. I think the simplest form of tension is a black and white canvas, or well, our version of black and white here that we've split diagonally. Look at this and think about how it makes you feel compared to this. This feels very safe, very sturdy. This could be the ground and the sky. It feels safe. But this feels like maybe they're pushing against one another, or maybe one is sliding down one is falling. My eyes want to run up and down this edge here and figure out, is this the edge of a mountain? Are these two blocks that are being pushed against one another from either side? And I think one of the main differences, like I mentioned earlier, is the angles this creates. Here we have one angle, 90 degrees, at the edge of the composition and with the elements interacting. Whereas here, we've got the 90 degrees of our artboard, but we also have the angles where we've split it into now two triangles. And those are different angles. These two might be closer to like 30 degrees and 60 degrees, or 50 and 40 degrees. There is a lot more variety. And that variety makes it more dynamic, makes it more interesting, and adds that element of motion and energy. Now, we can also use tension to balance a composition as well as imbalance it. First, let's imbalance this composition by changing the arrangement. We've got 4 squares perfectly balanced, but if we adjust the alignment, just one of these squares, this now creates a little bit of tension, something that's different going on here. And this makes this side feel a little bit heavy because these objects are maybe closer together. It feels like they have a bit more gravity. And if we angle one of them, now it feels even more so. There is more visual information here that we are now aware of. We have more shapes, more angles, and a more complex interaction. Now I think if we move these closer and change their angles, we could even add another square over here, and it doesn't really tip the balance over here too much. These kind of feel like they have more visual weight than maybe these 3 squares combined. Maybe you find these 3 squares have more visual weight, maybe that's a bit more overpowering, but this certainly makes it a lot closer. So this is something you can factor in when you want to add balance to your composition, or if you want to imbalance it to create more energy and draw more attention to somewhere. And like we've already established, balancing is very much done by feel. Can't go in with a calculator, calculate the angles, and work this out beforehand. You kind of need to feel what elements are pulling on one another and pulling you and your eyes across the canvas to get the effect that you want and the emotion and energy you want out of your composition. Now, balance and tension can be a great communicating tool, specifically because they affect our emotional reaction to an image. Let's say we're creating an explainer app for a meditation app. We can show a lot of contrast by having a nice balanced, solid composition, calm, flowing lines, very symmetrical here, and then contrast that with another composition that is very asymmetrical, that has loads of tension, loads of energy, that to me evokes a very stressful response. And we're communicating that largely with the composition, the amount of tension, the amount of balance in each of these. Now in photography and filmmaking, you may be familiar with the Dutch angle or the Dutch tilt, where the camera is rotated slightly. It's not aligned with the background of the main character, and that is done to make things feel uneasy and tense. Can it be overused? Absolutely. But know that you don't have to restrict yourself to a straight aligned shot facing towards the camera or your canvas and making everything aligned to right angles. By changing things up, by introducing new angles, you can make a static shot seem more interesting, add more motion, add more energy. And a little Easter egg, if you search Dutch angle on Google, the result is tilted. So fun fact I found while doing this section. All right, now let's take a look at some examples that have some interesting tension and energy. Now this design is done by a designer who goes just by Felipe, and this just has so much energy. It feels so alive, so dynamic. Almost every element in here feels like it's in motion. And I think that's largely because we have so many diagonal shapes. There are only really 2 shapes here that don't have a diagonal component. And this is this square here at the right, this bar, and I guess maybe this line at the bottom, but they do have the diagonal arrows as well. Everything else has angles involved. And we've got strong leading lines that point all to where this energy is concentrated. But we also have curved elements that take our eyes on somewhat more of a flowing organic journey to that part. But there are interesting angles everywhere. Even in the negative space of these curved areas, we have those sharp points. And we have motion in all these details, like this squiggle. This cloud at the bottom is like leaning to the right. It's been skewed to that way. So those feel like there's this motion thrusting it in that direction. Even this orange triangle is pushing our eyes up to the left. We're kind of forced to move all the way around the canvas. There are so many ways these lines and shapes are moving us around the canvas, and that creates so much energy. Our eyes can't really stay still looking at this. Now, this is an example that doesn't have so much energy by +1. This is very static. It almost feels like those balancing scales we were using earlier, because we have that big, strong centered S, very bold black line in the middle, and even these kind of supporting yellow elements that make it feel like, okay, this is all locked into the center here. But there is a little bit of tension caused by this barcode here. It feels a little bit too close to the S. Why is it here? It's kind of overlapping with this black bar in a strange way. Over here, this SL at least is kind of aligned horizontally to the bar and kind of spaced what feels like in between the S and the edge here. And that kind of does balance out the barcode a little bit. But the barcode, it has so much detail in it. And this tension in this negative space, I think, really draws the eye there. And it doesn't overwhelm the structure at all. The composition, largely symmetrical, really solid, balanced, but it does pull our attention down here to the barcode. And I want to show this example of how you can use tension to kind of skew the balance and draw attention and shift the hierarchy a little bit. Normally, a barcode is such a ubiquitous symbol that we're kind of encouraged and often just trained to ignore it. If this barcode was on the bottom right, I think we would have glossed over it entirely. But by placing it over here, it kind of gets our attention and brings it into the artwork and makes it stand out. Now, an artist and designer I absolutely love is Rune Fisker. They have such an incredible ability to add motion and energy to their designs, especially with their use of diagonals here. This one, we've got a completely asymmetric composition, and we've got really strong diagonal motions, leading lines following up this body and path of these characters. And not a single element in this composition is aligned horizontally or vertically. None. The whole environment is like viewed from like low angled camera that is tilted as well. And this whole gridded wall is off kilter. There is kind of no promise of a safe horizon line. We're just being thrown into this environment where everything seems to be in motion. All of these little lines that are falling off this character, they are all what appears to be at different angles. None of them are aligned flat. None of them are vertical. They're all bouncing around and adding to that energy. Now, I really love this composition, and I want to highlight how effective this is, being made of essentially 2 shapes. We can simplify this into one blue mass, and then I guess just the background, which is this cream color. Even with all of this going on, it can be reduced to a very simple composition. Now, these aren't necessarily particularly complicated shapes, but they are really interesting shapes. They have a lot of angles and a lot of round edges, and in just a few basic lines, we have contrast. And I just find that captivating. On their own, they feel alive and fluid. And that is what you want for an image like this. It is a solid structure of a composition, 2 fluid, energetic shapes that allow for all this detail to be added in. And there's not as much pressure for them to get that motion and fluidity right as well. Because even if the elements here were rigid and square, we would kind of get this flowing, energetic feel from the composition alone. Like I mentioned previously about carving it out of marble, these big basic structures that are carved out first, they are solid, they get the energy and the overall placement to feel right for this image first. Then they've carved in the details. And these details are all fantastic, because they are all working to serve the goal of this design. They're adding even more energy and motion and contrast. So in the blue shape, everything is rounded and organic, and everything in this cream shape is angled and kind of clinical. There is a big contrast in the shapes used and the colors. There's wonderful contrast. Fisker really is a fantastic artist and designer, and you might see this as more illustrative than graphic design, and it certainly is. But you can see that design has gone into it, that design thinking, that problem solving, the use of those design tools of contrast, of lines to effectively communicate. And I just love it. And because they are such good examples, let's look at a few more of Rune's artworks. This one, again, very asymmetrical. We have clear hierarchy. We're drawn to this character very clearly. They have the highest contrast. They have the most detail. And they are the only instance of these kind of warm blues being used in this canvas. But you can just absolutely feel how much energy is in this composition. Think of how this would feel if this was drawn arranged with the floor completely flat, and the objects that are all moving, falling towards the right, if they were all aligned with their sides horizontal and vertical, it would have nowhere near the amount of energy. But we have so many diagonal lines and leading lines pulling us over here. There's just so much energy on this page. And this last example from Fisker, this one just shows a beautiful contrast of the emotional feel you can get from those different kind of alignments and the amount of tension and balance. Here we've got characters emerging from a chaotic environment with lots of energy to a calm, more balanced one. Now everything on the left is at an angle which creates all these points in the negative space. And everything on the right is aligned horizontally and vertically. Even the lines on the floor, the perspective makes them go from being at a sharp angle to being completely straight on by the far right of the canvas. Even the curved lines are overlapping themselves, creating these squiggly lines and little moments where they almost touch the edge of shapes, which adds that tension and chaos to them over here. And on the right, even the clouds, almost like a rigid grid-like structure, but are then rounded off so it feels even more safe and secure. Everything feels so ordered on this side. I absolutely love this design. Now, I think this is the perfect summation of how you can use balance and tension in your designs, in your compositions. Communicate by creating that different emotional response.